Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. It was late enough that the kitchen felt like a place between days. The overhead light was off. Only the small lamp near the counter was on, casting a soft, uneven glow across the island. A glass sat half full of water. Ice clinked once as it settled, then went quiet. Somewhere in the building, a dishwasher hummed distant and steady. The person stood at the counter reading a message they had already read too many times. It wasn't long. It wasn't even especially cruel. Just a sentence with a tone that caught. A line that nudged exactly where it hurt. A comment that felt unnecessary and because of that, impossible to ignore. The body reacted before the mind finished interpreting it. A quick heat in the chest, a tightening behind the ribs. The tongue pressed lightly against the back of the teeth as if already forming words. There's a specific kind of anger that shows up like this. Not explosive, more like irritation with a hook in it. The message sat there on the screen, small and contained, but it pulled. It invited a response. Not a calm one, a sharp one. Something that would put things back in balance. Something that would sting just enough. The person set the phone down on the counter, face up. The screen dimmed, but the words stayed bright in the mind. Water was poured into the glass until it reached the rim. A few drops spilled over, sliding down the side, and pooling briefly on the counter before being wiped away with the edge of a sleeve. The action was automatic grounding. The first sip was taken quickly. The second was slower. The irritation didn't leave. It lingered like something caught just inside the mouth. Not painful exactly, but impossible to forget. The urge to bite down on it, to clamp, to pull back hard. There was a memory sudden and clear of fishing as a kid. Not the quiet, patient kind, the messy kind. Hooks scattered in a metal box, fingers nicked more than once. The shock of realizing too late that a hook had gone deeper when pulled the wrong way. The worst part wasn't the initial catch. It was the instinct to yank. Hooks work because they count on that instinct. The message on the phone felt like that now. A small barb, carefully placed, waiting for movement. The person leaned their hip against the counter and stared at the walleyes unfocused. The mind started assembling replies anyway. One version calm and firm, another sarcastic, another cutting. Each one felt satisfying in the imagination. Each one also tightened the chest a little more. The body knew this pattern, knew what came after. The brief rush of hitting send, the hollow feeling afterward, the replaying, the wondering if it went too far or not far enough. The hook doesn't disappear after you bite. It digs in. The phone buzzed again. Not a new message, just a notification from somewhere else. The sound was enough to make the jaw clench. That was when it became clear the hook wasn't just in the conversation. It was in the body now. Anger like this doesn't need much fuel. It feeds on attention, on repetition, on the simple act of chewing the same thought again and again. The person placed a hand flat on the counter. Cool surface, solid, real. The other hand wrapped loosely around the glass. The ice had melted slightly. The water tasted plain. There was a quiet recognition, not dramatic, not virtuous. I'm already hurt. Swallowing another sharp word wouldn't fix that. It would only add another thing to pull out later. The message on the phone stayed unanswered, not ignored. Just left where it was, the way you might leave a splinter alone for a moment instead of digging at it with dirty fingers. The irritation shifted. It didn't go away, but it changed shape. Less sharp, more like an ache. The person thought about how often arguments grow this way. One barb leads to another. One hook swallowed invites a second. Before long, both sides are bleeding and calling it honesty. The kitchen stayed quiet. The lamp hummed faintly. The night pressed gently against the windows. Nothing had been resolved. But something important had been noticed. When you've already bitten the hook, the next kind move isn't to swallow more bait. It's to stop pulling. The kitchen didn't change while the decision settled. The lamp stayed on. The glass of water stayed where it was. The phone remained face up on the counter, silent now, like it had said its piece and stepped back to watch what would happen next. There was a strange pause that followed. Not relief, not clarity, just a moment where nothing was being added. That was new. Usually this was the point where another thought would arrive sharper than the last. Another sentence would form, demanding expression. Silence often felt like losing ground, like letting the hook do its work. But standing there, hands resting on the counter, it became clear that the real damage didn't come from the first barb. It came from the tugging. The body noticed small things. The way the tongue rested in the mouth. the slight ache in the jaw from being clenched earlier, the shoulders still raised just enough to signal tension. All of it felt like evidence of something already caught. The instinct was to pull, to answer, to restore balance by making the other person feel what you felt. That instinct is fast, almost automatic. But hooks don't come out clean when you panic. Anyone who's ever had one embedded knows this. Pulling straight back only drives it deeper. The pain spikes, the damage spreads. What could have been a careful removal becomes a wound that takes longer to heal. The person reached for the phone, then stopped. Not out of willpower, but out of a sudden understanding sending another message right now would be exactly that pull. Instead, the phone was turned face down. Gently. No drama. Just a small adjustment in direction. The irritation flared briefly in response, like a muscle protesting when you stop using it the way it's weak. Then it softened, unsure where to go without a target. A breath came in slow and shallow. Another followed deeper, more settled. The chest loosened a little. Not all at once. Just enough. Silence, it turned out, wasn't passive. It was an action. Not the kind that proves anything. The kind that prevents further harm. Forgiveness started to feel less like a decision about the other person and more like a boundary around pain. A refusal to keep feeding something that was already hurting. The message hadn't disappeared. It still existed. The words were still there, but they no longer had teeth. The hook, once noticed, lost some of its power. The person took another sip of water. The glass was nearly empty now. The sound it made as it was set down was dull, final, a small closing. There would be a later moment to respond if needed. A moment when the body wasn't reacting. A moment when words could come from steadiness instead of sting. Or maybe there wouldn't be a response at all. Not every hook needs to be addressed. Some only need to be removed quietly. The dishwasher hummed on. A car passed outside. Life continued in its ordinary way, unaffected by the unsent reply. The irritation continued to fade, not into forgiveness exactly, but into space. Space where the body didn't have to stay alert. Space where the mind didn't need to sharpen itself. What remained was a clear sense of this swallowing. One more barb wouldn't make the pain smaller. It would only make it harder to heal. The night moved forward. The kitchen stayed dim and calm. The phone stayed silent. And somewhere between the counter and the quiet, the hook loosened simply because it was no longer being pulled. The night air felt sharp the moment the door opened. It rushed in cool and restless, brushing against skin that was still warm from inside. The street outside was brighter than expected. A gas station across the road glowed under fluorescent lights. Cars came and went in slow, uneven intervals. Somewhere nearby, wind moved through loose leaves, making a dry, skittering sound along the curb. The person stood still for a second, keys in hand, adjusting to the shift. Inside, everything had felt contained, predictable, quiet. Outside, the air carried a different mood, edgy, unsettled. The kind of air that makes tempers shorter and thoughts louder. Earlier, the argument hadn't ended cleanly. It hadn't exploded either. That almost made it worse. It ended with clipped sentences, with one person walking away while the other still had more to say, with that familiar sense of unfinished heat sitting just under the skin. The person had come out here to cool off. That was the plan anyway. As they crossed the lot toward the gas station, the wind picked up. Not strong, but steady. It pressed against the body, slipped under sleeves, tugged at loose fabric. The anger moved with it. The mind replayed the exchange, sharpening each line, imagining better timing, better phrasing, a final sentence that would have landed harder, something that would have closed the gap instead of leaving it open. A lighter was pulled from a pocket without much thought. Old habit. The thumb flicked it open, shielding the flame briefly as it caught. The small light flared bright and confident in the dark. For a moment it felt good. The flame steadied, casting a warm glow against the hand. The body leaned slightly forward, instinctively protecting it. Then the wind shifted. The flame bent sharply, sputtered, and sent a lick of heat back toward the fingers. Not enough to burn, but enough to sting. The person hissed softly and adjusted their grip, trying again to block the wind. The flame fought. The wind answered. The heat kept coming back. That was when the comparison landed. Anger held like this was a torch against the wind. It felt powerful in the hand. It promised clarity, direction, a way to see, but every step forward pushed the flame back toward the one carrying it. The lighter was closed with a click. The sudden darkness felt almost like relief. The person flexed their fingers, noticing the warmth lingering on the skin. Not painful, just enough to be felt. The argument replayed again, this time with more intensity. The urge to go back, to continue, to finish it properly, to say the thing that would finally make the other person understand. But standing there in the open air, it became obvious how exposed that urge was, how much energy it took to keep the anger lit against resistance. The wind didn't care about being convinced. It didn't slow down to listen. It just kept moving. The body noticed its own effort. The shoulders tense, the jaw set, the breath shallow as if preparing to push forward instead of step back. The anger hadn't made the person stronger out here. It had made them more vulnerable. Every gust redirected the heat inward. The gas station doors slid open and closed. Someone laughed briefly, then disappeared. Life continued in small, indifferent motions. The person stepped closer to the building, where the wind softened slightly. The air still moved, but less aggressively. The body responded right away. Shoulders dropped. Breath lengthened. The difference was immediate. It wasn't that the wind had stopped. It was that the person had stopped walking directly into it. The argument from earlier hadn't changed. The words were still said. The hurt was still real. But something about the posture shifted. The need to keep advancing, to keep pressing, eased just enough to notice the cost of doing so. Holding anger like a torch demanded constant adjustment, constant defense, constant awareness of how it might turn back on you. It wasn't peace. It was vigilance. The person leaned against the side of the building, feeling the cool surface through their jacket. The lighter rested heavy in the pocket now, unused. There was no decision yet to forgive, no resolution. Just a clear sense that continuing to charge forward with this heat wasn't making things safer. It wasn't making things clearer. It was only burning the hands that held it. The wind continued to move through the lot, indifferent and steady. And for the first time since the argument, the person stopped trying to fight it head on. The wind didn't stop. It moved around the building, slipped through open spaces, tugged at corners and edges. But here, pressed against the wall, it lost some of its force. It became background instead of opposition. The person stayed there longer than planned. Not to think things through, not to rehearse what to say next, just to feel what it was like not to push forward for a moment. The hands rested at the sides, now empty. Without the lighter, there was nothing to protect, nothing to aim. The fingers slowly uncurling felt almost unfamiliar, like a posture the body hadn't used in a while. Anger still lived there. It hadn't gone anywhere. But without motion, it didn't know what to do. That was the strange part. So much of the anger earlier had depended on direction, on momentum, on the idea that something had to be done with it, said finished, proven. Standing still broke that spell. The body noticed the difference immediately. The chest felt less compressed. The breath no longer stopped short at the top. The neck released a little, as if it no longer needed to brace for impact. The argument replayed again, but differently this time. Slower, less sharp. The words still had weight, but they didn't demand a counterstrike. The person realized how much effort it had taken to keep charging forward into the wind. How much energy had gone into holding the torch upright, keeping it lit, making sure it didn't go out or turn back. That effort had been mistaken for strength. But strength, it turned out, didn't feel like this. Strength felt quieter, less dramatic, more like choosing where not to stand. The lighter stayed in the pocket. The temptation to pull it out again flickered briefly, habit more than desire. Then it passed. The flame didn't need to be proven. Forgiveness began to make sense here, not as reconciliation, not as softness toward the other person, but as a change in orientation, a decision to stop walking directly into resistance. The wind hadn't been personal. It never is. It didn't know the details of the argument. It didn't care who was right. It simply moved the way it moved. Fighting it head-on had only guaranteed one outcome: getting burned. The person pushed off the wall and took a few steps back toward the car. Not rushing, not storming, just moving. With each step away from the open lot, the wind eased again. The difference was subtle but undeniable. Less noise, less pull. The body responded in kind. Forgiveness in this moment wasn't about letting anyone off the hook. It was about not letting the fire keep choosing the direction of the night. The anger could exist without being carried forward. The heat could cool without being extinguished violently. There would be a time to talk. Or not. A time to revisit what happened, or to let it remain unfinished. None of that needed to be decided right now. Right now, the body needed to stop being scorched by its own grip. The car door opened and closed again. Inside, the air was still, protected. the kind of quiet that doesn't argue with you. The seat accepted the body's weight without resistance. The keys turned. The dashboard lights came on softly. The world outside stayed windy, restless, unchanged. But inside the car, the flame was gone. Not destroyed, just set down. The person sat there for a moment before driving off, hands resting on the wheel, relaxed now. The earlier urge to rush back into the argument had faded into something more manageable, an awareness instead of a push. Anger, when met this way, didn't disappear. It transformed. It stopped being a weapon and became information. It stopped being fire and became warmth, distant and contained. The car pulled out of the lot, merging into the slow flow of traffic. Headlights stretched ahead, steady and calm. The wind continued to blow behind them, and for the first time that evening, it wasn't something to walk against. The bathroom was quiet, except for the sound of water. Not rushing, not splashing. Just a steady stream hitting tile, breaking into softer echoes that filled the small space. Steam gathered slowly, blurring the edges of everything without fully hiding it. The person stood under the shower, eyes closed, letting the warmth do what it always did. Loosen muscles that had been tight all day, soften joints that had been held too stiff for too long. That's when the anger showed up. Not loudly, not all at once. It came as a tightness in the chest, a thought that slipped in sideways, a memory of a conversation that had already ended but hadn't stopped moving inside. Someone's words, someone's tone, a look that landed wrong. It didn't seem like much on the surface, the kind of moment that other people might shrug off without thinking twice. But the body had reacted strongly, almost disproportionately. That was the part that didn't make sense. The water ran over the shoulders, down the back. A hand reached out to steady against the wall. The tile felt solid, cool under wet skin. The mind replayed the moment again, slower this time. Why did that bother me so much? The question wasn't asked gently at first. It carried an edge, an accusation, as if the anger itself were a problem to be solved. The body answered instead, a familiar tightness in the stomach, a subtle clench in the jaw, a shallow breath that didn't quite make it all the way down. This wasn't new. The realization came quietly without drama. This reaction had happened before. Different people, different situations, same sharp spike, same lingering heat. The water kept falling, patient and indifferent. The steam thickened, fogging the mirror just outside the shower door. Shapes softened, reflections blurred. A memory surfaced, uninvited but clear, standing in front of a mirror years ago, younger, trying to understand a feeling that didn't match the situation. Seeing the same tension in the face then, the same guarded expression, the same sense of being braced against something unseen. The mirror doesn't create what it shows. It only reflects what's already there. The anger from earlier began to feel less like an attack from the outside and more like a flare from somewhere inside. Not invented, but triggered. The water pressure shifted slightly, a different note in the sound. The body adjusted without thought. The person rested their forehead briefly against the tile wall, The heat felt grounding, the contact steady. It wasn't that the other person hadn't been careless or insensitive or wrong. They might have been. But the intensity of this reaction didn't belong entirely to them. It belonged to a place that had been touched, a place that hadn't healed yet. The mind resisted that idea at first. It wanted the anger to stay justified, clean, directed outward, easier that way. But the body didn't argue. It recognized the pattern. Anger in moments like this wasn't just a defense. It was a signal. Something inside had been reflected back too clearly. The mirror in the bathroom was now fully fogged. Only vague outlines remained. The person reached out and wiped a small circle with the palm of their hand. An eye stared back, then another. The face didn't look furious. It looked exposed. The water continued to fall steady and warm. The room held the sound without judgment. Forgiveness hadn't appeared yet. It didn't need to. What had appeared was understanding not of the other person, but of the self. A recognition that some reactions are echoes. Old vibrations stirred up by new contact. The anger softened slightly, losing its sharp edges. It didn't disappear, but it became less urgent, less demanding. The mirror showed what it always does, not who caused the pain, but where it lives. The water kept running, and for the first time since the moment earlier that day, the person stopped arguing with the reflection. The water was turned off slowly, not all at once. The sudden quiet felt louder than expected. Droplets slid down skin, then fell to the floor in soft, irregular taps. Steam lingered in the air, holding the warmth a little longer before letting it go. The person stayed there, still inside the fog. There was no rush to step out. No need to dry off yet. The moment felt unfinished, but not in a tense way. More like something was settling into place. The anger from earlier hadn't vanished. It hovered nearby, quieter now, less sharp. Without the noise of the water, it was easier to hear what it was actually saying. It wasn't shouting anymore. It was pointing. The mirror, still fogged except for the small cleared circle, reflected a softened version of the face. Lines less defined, edges blurred. The eyes looked tired, but calmer. The person wiped the mirror again, widening the clear space. More of the face came into focus. The expression wasn't accusing. It wasn't defensive. It looked like recognition. That comment earlier in the day, the one that had landed so hard, wasn't unique. It hadn't invented the pain. It had only pressed on something that was already sensitive. A place that had learned long ago to brace. The body remembered before the mind did. Moments of being dismissed, overlooked, spoken to in ways that felt small. Moments when reacting strongly hadn't been safe, so the reaction had learned to hide. Anger had become the guard at the door. It made sense now why it showed up so fast. Why it arrived with heat and certainty. It wasn't trying to start a fight. It was trying to protect something fragile. Understanding that changed the shape of it. The anger no longer felt like an enemy to suppress or justify. It felt like a messenger that had been misdirected for years. Forgiveness seen from here wasn't about the other person at all. It was about turning toward the place that had been reflected. The towel was reached for wrapped around the shoulders. The fabric was rough and familiar grounding. The body felt heavier now, more present. Standing in front of the mirror, the person didn't analyze their face, didn't critique it, didn't search for flaws. They just looked. The reflection didn't need correcting. It needed acknowledgement. The person who had triggered the anger earlier was probably moving on with their day by now. Their words already dissolving into other conversations, other concerns. They weren't carrying this moment anymore. But the body had been. And that was where forgiveness belonged. Not as a pardon, not as an excuse, as a release of the expectation that someone else should heal what they didn't break. The mirror showed a small nod, barely perceptible, a quiet agreement between the body and the reflection. I see you. I know why that hurt. The steam began to thin. The room cooled gradually. The outlines sharpened again. The anger continued to fade, not into indifference, but into something more workable, less explosive, more honest. The mirror returned to being just a mirror. The person stepped away, feet touching the bath mat, feeling the texture beneath them. Another ordinary sensation anchoring the moment. There would be other triggers, other reflections, other times when old wounds caught the light at the wrong angle. But now, there was a pause where there used to be a reaction, a moment to recognize what was being shown. The towel was hung up, the light dimmed, the bathroom returned to quiet, and somewhere between the fog and the clearing, the person learned this: not every anger is about the person in front of you. Sometimes it's about what they accidentally helped you see. And when that's the case, forgiveness starts at the mirror. The grocery parking lot was louder than it needed to be. Carts rattled over uneven pavement. Car doors opened and closed too hard. Somewhere a horn was held a second longer than necessary. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on everything, making even small sounds feel sharp. The person stood beside their car with the trunk open, one hand gripping a grocery bag, the other resting on the edge of the hatch. The bag was heavier than expected. Not because of what was inside, but because of how the body was holding itself. Tight, alert, ready. Earlier that day, everything had started piling up. Emails marked urgent, conversations that went nowhere, a last-minute change that unraveled careful plans, none of it catastrophic, all of it irritating in a way that stacked. Now it felt like the world was daring them to snap. Someone brushed past too close with a cart. Another car pulled into a spot, aggressively, tires squealing slightly. A voice nearby rose in frustration over something small and already lost. The chest tightened. The body leaned forward just a little, as if bracing against incoming weather. Anger in moments like this doesn't need a single cause. It feeds on accumulation. The grocery bag was lifted into the trunk and set down harder than intended. Cans clinked together loud and metallic. The sound echoed in the hollow space and then vanished. The mind immediately offered commentary. Of course this happens now. Why is everyone so careless? Can't anyone slow down? Each thought sharpened the next. The storm wasn't just outside, it was inside. The person closed the trunk part way, then stopped. The latch hovered inches from locking suspended. There was a memory not from today, but from long ago. Sitting through a storm as a kid. Rain pounding the roof so hard, it sounded like something trying to break in. Wind howling around corners, bending trees into unfamiliar shapes. And then the quiet. Not the end of the storm, but its center. The eye. A place where everything paused, where the air went still, where the chaos circled at a distance loud, but no longer on top of you. That memory came back now with surprising clarity. The trunk was closed gently this time. The sound was solid final, but not aggressive. The hand stayed there for a moment longer than necessary, palm flat against the cool metal. The body noticed its own posture. Shoulders lifted, jaw set, breath shallow. All signs of fighting weather. The parking lot hadn't done anything personal. Neither had the people in it. They were all just moving through their own versions of the same pressure. The person stepped back from the car and leaned lightly against it. The metal was cool through clothing, grounding. The noise didn't stop, but it changed in relation to the body. It was no longer everywhere. It was around. A cart clattered by. A child cried briefly, then quieted. An engine turned over and drove away. Sounds layered on top of each other, messy and human. The breath slowed just a fraction. The realization didn't arrive as wisdom. It arrived as relief. I don't have to match this pace. Anger had been pushing the body to meet the storm head on. To harden. To brace. To move faster and louder, just to stay upright. But standing here back against the car, it became clear how unnecessary that was. Storms don't respond to force. They don't calm because you yell back. They pass when they pass. The person stayed still for another moment. Not to meditate, not to escape, just to stop feeding the momentum. The mind tried once more to list grievances, to tally up reasons for irritation. It didn't get far. Without the body's full cooperation, the thoughts lost their edge. They became observations instead of weapons. The parking lot remained chaotic. Nothing had changed out there, but inside, something had. The storm was still happening, but the person was no longer standing in its center. They had stepped just slightly into a quieter place within it. And for the first time all day, that felt like enough. The parking lot didn't quiet down. If anything, it grew busier. Another row of cars arrived at once. A cart tipped over somewhere, metal clanging sharply before someone righted it. Voices overlapped, impatient, distracted, already late for something else. But leaning against the car, the person noticed something unexpected. The noise didn't feel as close. It was still loud, still messy, still irritating if examined too closely. But it no longer pressed directly against the chest. It hovered at a small distance, like weather seen through a window, instead of felt on bare skin. The breath found a slower rhythm without being guided. In through the nose, out through the mouth, not deep, not deliberate, just less hurried. The body had stopped trying to win. Earlier, anger had felt necessary, like armor, like the only way to move through all this friction without being knocked over. But armor is heavy, and wearing it for too long makes even standing feel like work. Standing here now, the person felt the difference immediately. The shoulders softened, the hands unclenched, the jaw loosened just enough to notice it had been tight all along. The storm continued to circle. A driver argued loudly with someone over a parking spot. A cart bumped the car lightly and rolled away. Someone muttered an apology without slowing down. None of it required a response. That realization carried an unexpected relief. So much anger is born from the belief that everything needs answering, that every disruption is a challenge, that every careless moment must be corrected or endured with force. But storms don't ask for engagement. They ask for shelter. The person thought again of that childhood memory, of sitting inside while rain lashed the roof, listening to the wind move around the house, feeling the violence of it without being pulled into it. The eye of the storm isn't created by fighting the wind. It exists because of where you stand. The hand lifted from the car and rested briefly over the chest. The heartbeat felt steady, present, not rushed. Forgiveness in this moment didn't feel like kindness toward anyone else in the parking lot. It felt like permission. Permission not to absorb the chaos. Permission not to harden in response. Permission to let the storm stay outside. The anger hadn't disappeared. It still flickered now and then, especially when a sound cut too sharply or someone moved too abruptly. But it no longer dictated posture or pace. It was weather, not identity. The person reached into the trunk again, this time calmly, and picked up the last bag. The weight felt different now, not lighter, but easier to carry. Walking toward the cart returned, the noise shifted again. The storm closed in slightly, then moved past. The body adjusted without panic. This was the eye. Not silence, not control. Just a place inside that stayed steady while everything else spun. There would be other days like this. Other crowded places. Other moments where irritation stacked until it felt personal and unavoidable. But now, there was a reference point. A knowing that calm doesn't require the world to cooperate. It requires a decision not to join the frenzy. The cart slid into place with a dull final sound. The person turned back toward the car. The sky remained gray. The parking lot remained loud. None of that needed fixing. The door opened. The seat welcomed the body. The door closed again, sealing off some of the noise, but not all of it. The engine started. The dashboard lights glowed softly. As the car pulled out of the lot, the storm was still there, swirling, impatient, unchanged. But the person carried the eye with them, and that was enough to move forward without anger choosing the direction. The porch was quiet in a way that felt earned. Not silent exactly. There was the soft movement of air through the trees, the occasional sound of a car passing a few blocks away, tires hissing briefly against pavement before fading. A porch light cast a warm circle that didn't reach very far, leaving the edges of the night untouched. The person sat on the steps elbows resting loosely on their knees. A thin blanket was folded beside them, unused. The air was cool but not uncomfortable. Earlier that day, words had been thrown their way, not shouted, not dramatic, just spoken casually, almost carelessly. Opinions, judgments, a few sentences that landed heavier than they were meant to. The kind of words people release and then forget about, assuming they'll dissolve on their own. They hadn't dissolved. They had followed the person home, settled somewhere behind the ribs, tightened the chest in small, quiet ways, returned during moments of stillness like now. The mind replayed them automatically. Why would they say that? What gives them the right? Do they really think that's who I am? Each replay sharpened the edge a little more. The night sky stretched overhead, dark and wide. Clouds moved slowly across it, their shapes changing as they went. They weren't dramatic clouds. No storm. Just thick enough to block stars, thin enough to keep moving. The person watched them without trying to. There was a familiar urge to answer the words from earlier, to correct the record, to defend, to explain, to make sure the version of them that lived in someone else's mind wasn't distorted. That urge carried heat. Anger in this form didn't feel explosive. It felt solid, like a weight pressing down. The porch step beneath them felt firm, unmoving. The wood held its shape without complaint. The contrast stood out. The clouds above shifted constantly. The step stayed where it was. A thought drifted in, uninvited and simple. I don't have to move for this. The words from earlier were still there, still sharp in memory, still unpleasant, but they were beginning to feel less like something that needed engagement and more like something passing through. Clouds don't ask mountains to respond. They don't insult them. They don't define them. They just pass. The person adjusted their position slightly, finding a more comfortable angle on the step. The movement was small, practical. The body responded with a slight easing. Earlier anger had pushed them to stand up inside, to brace, to prepare for argument, to gather evidence, to rehearse explanations that might never be used. Sitting here now, none of that felt necessary. The mountain doesn't chase clouds away. It doesn't argue with their shapes. It doesn't try to prove its solidity. It remains. The words from earlier began to feel lighter. Not gone, just less dense. They still existed, but they no longer pressed so hard against the chest. The person noticed their breath for the first time in a while. It moved steadily, not deep, not shallow, just present. The clouds continued their slow crossing. One thinned out its edges, dissolving into the dark. Another drifted in behind it, briefly taking its place. The words in the mind did something similar. One replay faded. Another appeared, then softened. Nothing was being forced away. Nothing was being held. The porch light hummed faintly. A moth circled it once, then disappeared into the night. The world carried on without commentary. Forgiveness hadn't arrived yet. It didn't need to. What had arrived was space. Space between the person and the words. space where the body didn't need to tense, space where identity wasn't up for debate. The mountain doesn't absorb the clouds. It doesn't become them. It lets them pass overhead, knowing they'll change shape and move on, whether it reacts or not. The person stayed seated, watching the sky shift, feeling the steadiness beneath them. And for the first time since the words were spoken, it felt possible not to carry them any further tonight. The night grew a little deeper while the person sat there. Not darker in a dramatic way, just quieter. The street sounds thinned out. The air cooled another degree, enough to notice on the skin, but not enough to be uncomfortable. The porch light stayed steady, unchanged by the shift. The clouds kept moving. Some thickened briefly, gathering into heavier shapes, then stretched thin again, as if pulled apart by an invisible hand. None of them stayed long enough to become anything fixed. The words from earlier followed the same pattern now. One surfaced, paused, then drifted on. They no longer arrived as a solid block. They came in fragments, losing their weight as they passed through attention. The sting that had felt so sharp before softened into something dull, then into something almost neutral. The person realized how much effort had gone into holding those words in place, replaying them, interpreting them, arguing with them silently. That effort had felt necessary, like vigilance, like self-respect. But sitting here, it was clear that vigilance wasn't the same as stability. The porch step didn't strain to stay solid. It didn't tense against the night air. It didn't react when clouds blocked the stars. It simply stayed. The body took that in. The shoulders dropped a little more. The chest felt less compressed. The breath moved without obstruction, as if it had been waiting for permission. Forgiveness, when it finally appeared, didn't come with emotion. No warmth, no reconciliation, no sense of moral victory. It came as a practical understanding. The words don't need a home in me. They could exist somewhere else, in the air, in memory, in someone else's mind, but they didn't need to live in the body. The mountain doesn't store clouds. It doesn't cling to them. It doesn't follow them once they pass. The person leaned back slightly, letting their weight settle into the step. The wood creaked softly, adjusting, then held. There would be other days like this. Other comments, other judgments, other moments when someone else's words would drift too close and brush against something sensitive. That didn't need denying. But tonight had made something clear: reacting wasn't the only way to protect oneself. Standing still was an option too. The mind tested this new understanding briefly, offering one last replay of the words just to see if they still hurt. They didn't land the same way. They arrived thin, faded faster, left less behind. Not because they were suddenly true or false, but because they no longer had a surface to stick to. The clouds continued on, opening small patches of sky where stars briefly showed through. One by one, faint points of light appeared, then vanished again as another cloud passed. Nothing stayed fixed. Nothing needed correction. The person stood up slowly, brushing their hands against their legs to warm them. The movement felt unhurried, complete. The anger that had been there earlier wasn't gone. it had simply lost its anchor. Without the words to grip it, had nowhere to settle. Inside the house waited, warm, ordinary, safe. Before stepping back through the door, the person looked up once more at the sky. Another cloud slid past, already changing shape, already moving on. The mountain never chased it, and tonight, neither did they. The porch light was turned off. Darkness folded in gently. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Outside, the clouds kept drifting. Inside, something stayed. A lot of anger doesn't announce itself as anger. It shows up as certainty, as the feeling that you're simply seeing things the way they are, that you're not being harsh, just realistic. But the body doesn't care much about being right. The body just carries the weight. The tight jaw, the shoulders that never quite drop, the quiet readiness even when nothing is happening. That evening, she stood in her small living room with a paper towel tucked under her arm and a spray bottle in her hand. Cleaning the window hadn't been on her plan. Rest had. But the front glass had caught the streetlight at the wrong angle, making every fingerprint and streak stand out, and something in her had latched onto it. The phone lay face down on the coffee table. Earlier, a message had come through. Short, dismissive, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Not cruel enough to justify a big reaction, just enough to leave a sting. The kind of message that sits in the background, replaying itself when the room finally gets quiet. She lifted the spray bottle and misted the glass. Tiny droplets scattered across the surface, and when she wiped, the familiar squeak followed. Soft, repetitive, almost soothing. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires whispering against damp pavement. The apartment itself was still lit only by a warm lamp in the corner. She wiped in long strokes, her mind moving the way it always did when she was upset. It ran through examples. People who took without asking, people who never apologized, people who acted like their bad days gave them permission to be careless with others. If anyone asked, she would have said she wasn't angry. She was just done. Done excusing. Done expecting better. The paper towel snagged and tore slightly. She stopped, replaced it, pressed the new sheet flat against the glass. Her reflection shifted in the wet surface, blurred, stretched, broken into pieces by streaks of cleaner. For a moment, she didn't see a face so much as a shape behind a mess. The window wasn't filthy. It wasn't ruined. It was just layered. A week of dust, a few fingerprints, things that hadn't seemed worth noticing until the light hit them just right. She wiped slower. The sound changed. Less squeak, more glide. And with that small change, something in her chest loosened, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be noticeable. She didn't think about forgiveness. That word felt too heavy, too final, like it demanded something she wasn't ready to give. She wasn't trying to become softer for anyone else. She just wanted the pressure inside her to ease. She noticed how tightly she'd been holding her shoulders, how her breath had been stopping short without her realizing it. As she reached the lower edge of the window, she exhaled longer than before, the kind of breath that happens when the body decides it's safe enough to let go a little. Outside, a couple walked through the pool of streetlight, one carrying a takeout bag, the other pulling a jacket closed. They passed without drama, without meaning, just people moving through their night. She watched them for a second through the cleaner glass. The world didn't suddenly look kinder. It just looked quieter, less personal. She dragged the towel along the bottom edge where grime always collected. The dirt lifted in a dull gray smear, and she felt a strange sense of relief, not because it was gone, but because it had been simple. No argument, no justification. Just noticing something and clearing it. Her phone buzzed once on the table. She didn't reach for it. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she didn't need to answer from this tight place. Standing there, she realized something gently, without turning it into a rule. When hurt stays too close to the surface, it colors everything you see. It doesn't mean your experiences weren't real. It doesn't mean your anger is wrong. It just means the glass you're looking through has been carrying more than it needs to. She finished the window. Not perfectly. There were still faint streaks if you looked closely. But the harshness had softened. The streetlights outside no longer felt like they were pressing in on her. She set the spray bottle down and listened to the apartment. The clock ticking, the fridge humming. Somewhere far away, a siren rose and faded. She wasn't ready to forgive anyone. She didn't need to be. For now, it was enough to know this. She didn't have to keep her face pressed against dirty glass to prove she'd been hurt. She turned off the lamp and walked away from the window, leaving it as it was clear enough. She didn't look at the phone right away, not because she was afraid of what it said, but because she could feel how easily her body would tighten again if she reached for it too fast. So she let it sit there, screen down, while she rinsed her hands at the sink and dried them slowly on a towel that had already seen better days. When she finally picked the phone up, the room hadn't changed. The lamp was still dim. The apartment was still quiet. Nothing dramatic had shifted in the outside world. That helped. It meant she wasn't walking back into the moment the message first landed. She was entering it from somewhere slightly steadier. The message was still what it had been, a few lines, careless in tone, light where it should have been thoughtful. The kind of message that read from the wrong place could reopen a whole history of being overlooked. She felt the familiar spark move through her chest. Not a full flame, more like heat under the skin. Her first impulse was immediate and well-practiced: explain herself, correct the record. Make sure she wasn't misunderstood. Make sure the other person knew they were wrong. Her thumbs hovered over the screen. She noticed how her breath had shortened again. Not all the way, just enough to be a warning. It was the same signal she'd learned to recognize over time, the one that said, if you answer now, you won't actually be answering this message. You'll be answering every other one that came before it, so she didn't type. She read it once more, slower. This time she paid attention not just to the words, but to what happened inside her as she read. The tightening, the urge to defend, the old sense of having to prove her reality was real. She wasn't wrong for feeling that. Anyone in her place would have felt it. But she could see something else too now, that the window behind her was cleaner. The message wasn't the whole story. it was a fragment. A snapshot taken without context, without tone, without the weight of everything she'd been carrying, and the meaning she was about to pour into it. They don't care, they never listen, they always do this. That part was coming from a place that was already tired. She set the phone down again, face up this time. Outside, the street had gone quieter. Fewer cars, longer gaps between sounds. The night was doing what it always did, slowly lowering the volume on everything. She sat back on the couch and let her shoulders drop fully this time. No effort, just gravity. Her hands rested open on her lap, empty. For a moment, she didn't do anything at all. And in that moment, the anger didn't grow. It didn't disappear either. It just stayed the same size, like something being watched instead of fed. She thought about how often anger asks to be proven right, how it wants witnesses, how it wants rehearsal and repetition, how easily attention becomes oxygen. She wasn't interested in putting the fire out by force. She just didn't want to keep fanning it. When she picked up the phone again, she typed a response, but not the one that had been waiting in her chest all evening. The words were shorter, plainer, less precise maybe, but also less sharp. She didn't explain the entire history. She didn't outline every reason she was justified in feeling hurt. She simply named what was true for her in that moment without adding heat. She read it once, then once more. Not to perfect it, but to feel how her body responded to it. The message didn't give her a rush. It didn't feel victorious. That was how she knew it was different. She sent it. The phone didn't light up again right away. There was no instant relief, no resolution, just space. And in that space, she noticed something quiet and important: forgiveness. At least the kind she could live with. Didn't feel like letting someone off the hook. It felt like stepping back from the edge of something that had been costing her more than it was costing them. She wasn't saying what happened was okay. She wasn't pretending it hadn't hurt. She wasn't offering closeness where there wasn't safety. She was simply choosing not to carry the weight of it any longer than necessary. The window behind her reflected less now that the lamp was off. It had become almost invisible, just a darker square against the night. She liked that. It meant she wasn't focused on it anymore. She stood, turned off the last light, and let the room settle into darkness. The anger hadn't vanished, but it had loosened its grip enough for her to move without it steering. Tomorrow things might feel different. The message might be answered in a way she didn't like, or not answered at all. But that was tomorrow's wait. Tonight she had done enough. She lay down without replaying the conversation again. The streetlight glow barely reached the ceiling. Her breath found its own rhythm. The glass between her and the world didn't need to be perfectly clean. It just needed to be clear enough for her to rest. Anger can feel like energy, like clarity, like you finally have the courage to say what you should have said. And sometimes it really is that. But there's another kind of anger that doesn't bring anything clean with it. It just brings heat. It doesn't solve the problem. It keeps the problem alive because it keeps feeding it. He was sitting in his car in the driveway, engine off, seatbelt already unclicked, hands still on the steering wheel, like he hadn't fully arrived home yet. The house was dark, except for a faint glow through the blinds. The neighborhood was quiet in that late-hour way. No lawn sprinklers, no kids, no garage doors, just the occasional far-off sound of tires passing over a main road. The phone was in the cup holder. The screen was lit. A thread of messages sat open, and his thumb hovered over the keyboard. He had typed something sharp, deleted it, typed something longer, explaining everything, deleted that too, then typed something short again, too short, the kind of short that's really a slap. He wasn't proud of any of it, but he also didn't feel calm. Calm wasn't available. What he felt was that tight, bright pressure behind the eyes, like a light turned up too high in his head. It had started as something small earlier in the day. A comment, a tone, a little joke that wasn't funny. The kind of moment you can brush off in public, then later, when you're alone, it replays with different lighting. In the replay, you notice the disrespect more clearly. You notice the pattern. You notice how long you've been swallowing things. By the time he got in the car after work, the anger had already grown. Not because the original moment got worse, but because he kept returning to it. Each return brought a fresh surge, like throwing another log onto the same fire. Now in the driveway, he could feel his body wanting motion. His knee bounced once. His shoulders were forward. His jaw was tight. He stared at the words he'd typed. They felt satisfying in a dark way, like hitting a wall with your fist. Painful, but honest. Immediate. He was about to send it. Then, the strangest thing happened. Not an insight, not a spiritual moment, just a tiny, ordinary detail that interrupted the whole machine in his head. The porch light clicked on across the street. A neighbor stepped outside for a second, barefoot, holding a small bag of trash. The light turned their face into a pale blur for a moment, then they disappeared back inside. The porch light stayed on. That was it. Nothing important. But the pause it created in him was real. Like the mind had tripped over something neutral and for a second stopped sprinting. He looked at his phone again and saw something he hadn't wanted to see. This message wasn't going to fix anything. It wasn't even going to express what he really felt. It was only going to spread the fire into tomorrow. Because anger, when it's hot, doesn't just want to speak. It wants to land. It wants to hurt back. It wants the other person to feel what you felt. And the problem is, once you send that kind of message, you can't take it back. Even if you apologize later, even if you explain later, the heat stays in the room. His thumb hovered again. He felt his chest tighten, like his body was arguing. Send it. They need to know. They deserve it. And maybe part of that was true. Maybe the other person had been careless. Maybe they had been unfair. Maybe they had been repeating the same pattern for years. But there was another truth, too quieter and less dramatic. He didn't want to spend his night like this. He didn't want to give his attention to the same flame over and over, just to keep it alive. He had once watched a video about wildfires, how wind feeds them, how dry brush becomes fuel, how one gust can turn a contained fire into something that eats miles. He remembered one line from a firefighter interview, something simple. You don't fight a wildfire by giving it more oxygen. He wasn't dealing with a forest. He was dealing with a message thread. But his body felt the same. The same heat. The same spreading. He set the phone down in the cup holder and forced himself to do one thing that wasn't about the conversation. He looked around the car like he'd never been in it before. The dashboard dust. The little stack of receipts in the console. The faint smell of coffee that had spilled weeks ago and never fully left, the silence that existed, whether he was angry or not. For a full 10 seconds, he did nothing. In that small pause, the anger didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped being a command. It became a feeling. Still unpleasant, still real, but no longer in charge. He picked the phone up again. The message was still there waiting. He didn't delete it yet. He just stared at it and asked himself one plain question. If I send this, does my life get calmer or does it get louder? The answer came fast. He didn't want louder, so he didn't send it. Not because the other person was right, not because he was above it, but because tonight he could feel the cost. He could feel how attention was feeding the fire and how he was the one holding the match. He placed the phone face down again, like closing a lid. Then he finally took his hands off the steering wheel and let them rest in his lap. The porch light across the street was still on. A small, steady glow. It didn't ask anything from him. It didn't demand a response. It just existed quiet and constant while the rest of the neighborhood slept. He sat there a moment longer, letting that steadiness be contagious. He stayed in the car longer than he needed to. Not because he was frozen, but because he could feel how close he still was to doing something he'd regret. The anger hadn't left. It had just stopped shouting. Now it sat in his chest like a hot coal, quiet, but very much alive. He knew this feeling. The part where you don't explode, but you don't feel better either. The part where restraint starts to feel like pressure. Like holding a door shut while something keeps pushing from the other side. He opened the car door and stepped out into the night. The air was cooler than inside the car, and that helped. He locked the door, the soft click sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. The house stood there, familiar and dark, waiting. Inside, he didn't turn on the overhead lights, just the small lamp by the couch. The room felt still, like it was holding its breath. He set his keys down and noticed his hands were slightly shaky. Not dramatically, just enough to be honest. He sat on the edge of the couch and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The phone was still in his pocket, heavy. He could feel it even without touching it. The old habit would have been to distract himself. Turn on the TV, scroll, drown the feeling in noise until it dulled. But tonight, something in him wanted to do less, not more. He wanted the fire to burn down on its own without fresh fuel. Anger has a strange relationship with time. When you keep feeding it, it feels urgent, immediate. like something has to be done right now. But when you stop feeding it, it reveals something else underneath. Often it's hurt, or disappointment, or the tired feeling of having the same boundary crossed again. He closed his eyes for a moment and let his breath drop lower. Not in a practiced way, just enough to notice that it could. Images floated up without being invited. Other moments with the same person, different days, different words, all small, none catastrophic. But together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are what turn irritation into anger. He saw something else too, and it wasn't flattering. He saw how much of his energy he'd been giving away by replaying the same story. How the other person had moved on hours ago while he was still sitting in the heat of it. That realization didn't make him kinder. It made him tired. He stood up and walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, drank it slowly. The cold helped. It anchored him in something physical, something real. The anger didn't disappear, but it lost some of its edge, like a blade set down instead of being swung. He thought again about the wildfire image. How fires don't only consume what they touch, they change the air. They make it hard to breathe even for people far away from the flames. He didn't want to live in that air. He picked up his phone and looked at the message again. It still bothered him. That hadn't changed. But now he could see it without the red haze around the edges. He could read it as one moment, not a verdict on his worth or a summary of the relationship. He deleted the unsent message, not as a gesture of forgiveness, just as a practical decision. Those words belonged to a version of him that was overheated. He didn't need to give them a future. He opened a new note instead and typed a few sentences that he didn't plan to send to anyone. They weren't polite, they weren't measured. They were honest in the rawest way. He wrote exactly what had hurt, exactly what he wished had been different. He didn't soften it. He didn't justify it either. He let it exist. When he was done, he put the phone down and didn't reread it. The words had done their job just by leaving his body. He noticed then how much space there was in the room, how the quiet wasn't empty but full of ordinary sounds, the fridge cycling on, the faint tick of a clock somewhere, his own breathing slower now. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't arrive as a feeling, at least not tonight. It arrived as a choice not to keep setting himself on fire to keep someone else warm. It arrived as the decision to stop feeding something that only grew when he paid it attention. Tomorrow he might say something, or he might not. He could address the issue later from a steadier place, or he could decide it wasn't worth reopening. Both options existed now, and having options felt better than being trapped in reaction. He turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a moment. The anger was still there, faint but present. He didn't push it away. He just didn't invite it to take over the night. As he lay down, the image of the porch light across the street came back to him. Steady, unbothered, not fighting the dark, just illuminating its own small circle. That felt like enough. He let the night take the rest. The kind of anger that scares you isn't always the loud kind. Sometimes it's the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't shout. It just hardens. It settles in like dry ground that hasn't seen rain in a long time. You can still function. You can still smile at the right times. You can still get through a day. But inside, everything feels stiff, tight, like you've stopped expecting softness because softness keeps getting stepped on. That night, they were standing at the kitchen sink, sleeves pushed up the faucet, running in a thin, steady stream. The dishwasher was on behind them, doing its slow, rhythmic job, water moving, turning, humming like a distant machine in a different room. The only light in the kitchen came from a small lamp on the counter. Warm, dim, enough. They weren't washing dishes because the dishes demanded it. They were washing dishes because their hands needed something simple to do. Earlier, there had been a moment at work that shouldn't have mattered this much. A comment, a little edge in someone's voice, a kind of casual impatience that landed like a slap because it wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the fifth. It was just part of the pattern. The kind of pattern that makes your body start bracing before you even walk into the building. They had nodded, kept their tone neutral, done what they needed to do. On the outside, it looked fine. But on the drive home, their mind began building the whole case. Everything they should have said. Everything they were tired of swallowing. All the small humiliations that stacked up until one more made the pile topple. Now in the kitchen, the anger wasn't exploding. It was simmering. It felt like a tight band around the ribs, like pressure behind the eyes, like the urge to be sharp with anyone who got too close. They set a mug on the counter and poured hot water into it. The steam rose quietly. They dropped in a tea bag, nothing fancy, just something familiar, and watched the water darken in slow swirls. The spoon hit the side of the mug with a soft clink as they stirred. Clink, clink, clink. A small sound, a steady sound, a sound that didn't argue with them. They didn't think, I need to forgive. That would have felt ridiculous. Too big, too clean. They weren't in a clean place. They were in a tired place. The kind of tired that makes anger feel like armor. They took one sip. Too hot. They set the mug down, exhaled through their nose, and turned back to the sink. A plate, a fork, a pan with a stubborn ring of dried sauce that required more effort than it deserved. They scrubbed a little too hard at first. The sponge squeaked. Their hand pressed down like the pan had personally offended them. And then they noticed what they were doing. Not in a judging way, just noticing. It was the same pressure they wanted to put into their words earlier, the same force behind the message they almost wanted to send, the same desire to make something give. They stopped scrubbing for a second and let the pan sit under the warm water. The heat loosened the dried ring without drama, without violence, just time and warmth and repetition. They watched it soften, and something in their chest shifted, not because the problem was solved, but because the method was different. They didn't have to attack the pan to change it. They didn't have to punish it. They didn't have to win. They just had to stay with it long enough, gently enough for it to loosen. It felt almost annoying how true that was. Anger wants immediate results. It wants a moment that feels satisfying. A sharp sentence, a comeback, a slammed door, a message that lands like a punch. But life rarely changes from one punch. Life changes from what you keep doing over time, from what you repeat. They rinsed the pan, set it aside, and listened to the dishwasher hum. The kitchen smelled faintly like soap and steam. The night outside the window was dark and still. They thought about the person who'd been sharp with them earlier, just for a second. Not as an enemy, not as a villain, just as a human body moving through a day. A person with their own tight chest, their own pressure, their own dry places inside. That thought didn't make what happened okay. It didn't erase anything, but it did something small. It loosened the story that said, "This is personal. This is about me. They're doing this because I'm not worth respect." Maybe it wasn't about worth at all. Maybe it was about dryness meeting dryness. They took another sip of tea, still hot but drinkable now. Their shoulders lowered a fraction. They looked at the sink, still full of dishes, still unfinished. They didn't feel cheerful. They didn't feel saintly. They just felt a little less clenched. Outside, the world wasn't dramatic either. The night didn't demand a verdict. The night didn't ask them to be the bigger person in some heroic way. It just offered a quiet space where the heat could cool if they stopped adding fuel. They turned the faucet down and let the water run softer. A calmer sound. Less force, more flow. And they kept going, one plate, one fork, one slow breath at a time, without trying to fix their whole heart in a single evening. They left the last dish in the rack to dry on its own and turned off the faucet. The sudden quiet felt louder than the water had been. For a moment they just stood there, hands resting on the edge of the sink, feeling the warmth slowly leave their skin. The anger was still present. It hadn't vanished during the dishes. It just wasn't hard anymore. It felt more like a sore muscle than a clenched fist. Something tender instead of sharp. They carried the mug to the table and sat down, wrapping both hands around it. The heat seeped in, steady and patient. Outside the window, the night had settled into a deep stillness. No cars passed. No voices floated up. Just the faint reflection of the kitchen light on dark glass. They thought again about the moment from earlier. The tone, the look, the way the comment had landed. Their body replayed it, but this time the replay didn't speed up. It moved slower, like a scene watched from a little farther away. What stood out now wasn't the words themselves, but the weariness underneath them. Not just in the other person, but in themselves. The exhaustion of always adjusting, of always absorbing the edge so things wouldn't escalate, of carrying the unspoken expectation to be patient, to be kind, to be the one who smooths things over. That was the part that had hardened. Not cruelty, fatigue. They set the mug down and leaned back in the chair. The anger had been trying to protect that tired place. It had been saying, "Enough. I can't keep being scraped like this." When they saw it that way, the anger made more sense. It wasn't something to crush. It was something to listen to carefully. Gentleness didn't mean ignoring that message. It meant deciding how to respond to it. They imagined what would happen if they reacted the way the anger wanted. The sharp words, the cold distance, the satisfaction that would last a few seconds, maybe a minute. And then the quiet aftermath, the tension, the regret, the sense of having made things harder, not clearer. They'd been there before. They also imagined doing nothing, just swallowing it again, letting the dryness stay dry. That path felt familiar too, and heavy. So they looked for a third option, not dramatic, not noble, just workable. The rain image came back to them not as poetry, but as something practical. Dry ground doesn't soften all at once. You don't pour a bucket of water on it and expect it to change. That just runs off the surface. What changes it is slow rain, repeated, unimpressive, the kind you barely notice until one day the ground gives a little under your foot. They didn't need to forgive everything tonight. They didn't need to have the perfect conversation. They just needed to choose one small action that didn't add more heat. They picked up their phone and opened a blank note. Not a message, just a place to put words where they wouldn't hurt anyone. They wrote a few sentences, plain, honest, unpolished. What had bothered them? What they wished had been different, where they felt stretched thin. They didn't analyze the sentences. They didn't turn them into a script. They just let them exist. When they finished, they closed the note without saving it. The anger eased a little more, not because it had been solved, but because it had been acknowledged. They rinsed the mug and set it in the rack. The dishwasher hummed on, steady and unbothered by any of this. The kitchen light felt softer now, like it had dimmed on its own. Tomorrow they might say something. Or they might wait and see. They could choose their moment, their tone, their timing. That choice didn't have to be made under pressure. It didn't have to be made while their chest was still tight. Forgiveness, they realized, didn't have to look like warmth towards someone who had been careless. Sometimes it looked like not turning hard yourself, like keeping your own inner ground from cracking further. They turned off the kitchen light and walked into the darker part of the house. The air felt cooler, calmer. The anger was still there, faint, but present, like the smell of rain after it stopped. They lay down without replaying the moment again. Their breath found a slower pace, not because they forced it, but because nothing was pushing anymore. The ground inside them hadn't turned soft overnight, but it had absorbed a little water, and that was enough for now. Some grudges don't feel dramatic. They feel reasonable, like something you've earned the right to carry. They sit quietly in the background of your day, flavoring everything just a little. Conversations taste sharper. Silence tastes bitter. Nothing is unbearable, but nothing is clean either. That evening, she was at a laundromat a few blocks from home, the kind that stayed open late and smelled faintly of detergent and warm metal. Rows of machines thumped and turned in steady rhythm. A TV bolted to the wall played a muted game show no one was really watching. The fluorescent lights were bright but tired. She slid coins into a washer and pushed the door closed with her hip. The machine started with a low churn, water rushing in like it always did. She sat down on a hard plastic chair and set her bag at her feet. This wasn't where she planned to be tonight. But her apartment washer had broken again, and she didn't have the patience to deal with it. The day had already asked too much. Earlier, there had been a call. Short, familiar. A voice on the other end that knew exactly how to press the old buttons without raising its own volume. Nothing outright cruel, just dismissive enough. Enough to remind her of how often she'd been expected to understand, to bend to be the bigger person. She'd hung up politely. She always did. Now sitting there, the anger came back in waves. Not sharp, but salty. Like something she'd been sipping from all day without realizing how much it was dehydrating her. She leaned back and watched the washer spin. Clothes slapped gently against the drum, socks, shirts, a towel she'd owned for years. Ordinary things going around and around, over and over, until they came out clean. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it. She already knew who it would be. Or maybe not who, but what. Another message. Another attempt to smooth things over without actually changing anything. She crossed her arms and felt the familiar tightening in her chest. It wasn't just about tonight. It never was. It was about the accumulation. The way small hurts stacked up until they felt heavy. On the vending machine near the door, a plastic bottle of water reflected the harsh light. She stood, walked over, fed in a few coins, and twisted the cap off. The water was cold, almost painfully so. She took a long drink. It tasted off. Not bad exactly. Just wrong. She frowned and took another sip. Same thing. A faint bitterness she couldn't place. She looked at the bottle, then at her hand. There was salt on her fingers, left over from a soft pretzel she'd grabbed earlier without thinking. She'd wiped her hand on a napkin, but not enough. The salt had transferred to the bottle's mouth. She laughed quietly at herself. A small sound quickly swallowed by the machines. One pinch of salt didn't seem like much, but in a small bottle it changed everything. She rinsed the bottle cap at the sink and drank again. This time the water tasted clean, neutral, what it was supposed to be. She stood there a moment longer, letting that register, not as a lesson, not as advice, but as a simple fact. Some things only stay bitter because you keep them in a small container. She went back to her chair and watched the washer finish its cycle. The machine slowed, then stopped with a final dull thud. She moved her clothes to the dryer, poured in detergent, closed the door. Another rhythm began. Thump. Pause. Thump. The anger in her chest shifted. It didn't disappear, but it spread out. It felt less concentrated, less sharp. She thought about the call again, but this time without rehearsing what she should have said. She thought about it like it was just one drop in a much bigger body of water. Important, yes, but not the whole story of her life. Forgiveness didn't feel close. That word still felt like something she wasn't ready to touch. But something else felt possible, not carrying this one moment so tightly. She imagined holding the resentment like a small fistful of salt. powerful in the palm, sharp on the tongue, useful in the right amount, but punishing when kept close. She didn't need to throw it away tonight. She didn't need to pretend it didn't exist. She just needed to stop drinking from it. The dryer hummed on. The TV flickered. Someone laughed softly on the other side of the room. Life continued unbothered by the tight story she'd been telling herself. She took another sip of water. Clean, simple. And for the first time that evening, her shoulders dropped without being told. She folded her clothes slowly, one piece at a time, as the dryer finished its last lazy turn. The warmth clung to the fabric, familiar and grounding. A shirt, a towel, a pair of socks that never quite stayed together. Ordinary things warm in her hands, asking for nothing more than to be put away. The laundromat had grown quieter. One machine stopped. Another started. Somewhere near the door, someone yawned without trying to hide it. The TV was still on, but no one was watching anymore. She stacked the folded clothes neatly in her basket and sat for a moment before standing. The anger was still there, but now it felt diluted, like it had been spread across a wider space instead of sitting heavy in one tight spot. On the drive home, she noticed how her thoughts kept trying to return to the call, the familiar pull. The urge to replay it, polish it, squeeze meaning out of every word. Each time it surfaced, she didn't push it away. She just let it widen the way water widens when it meets something larger. By the time she parked, the street was quiet. Porch lights glowed softly. A dog barked once, then settled. She carried the laundry inside and set it down without rushing to put everything away. In the kitchen, she poured herself another glass of water. This time, she rinsed her hands first without thinking. The glass was clean. The water tasted like nothing at all. And that nothing felt like relief. She leaned against the counter and drank it slowly. Her body responded before her thoughts did. A small sigh. A release she hadn't planned. She thought again about the person on the other end of the phone call. Not with tenderness, not with blame either. Just with distance. Enough distance to see that whatever they carried, whatever they were repeating, didn't need to become her entire inner climate. It struck her then how often resentment behaves like a solution. How it promises protection, control, clarity. But what it really does when held too close is shrink the space you live in. Everything starts to taste the same. Sharp, overbearing, too much. She didn't need to forgive tonight. She didn't need to call anyone back or write a careful message. She just needed to notice the size of the container she was holding this feeling in. She imagined the resentment again as salt. In a small glass, it ruined the water. But poured into a lake, it disappeared. Not because it was denied, but because it wasn't concentrated anymore. Her life was bigger than this moment, bigger than this call, bigger than the pattern she was tired of. That thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. She carried the basket to the bedroom and set it at the foot of the bed. Instead of folding everything right away, she lay back for a moment, still dressed lights low. The ceiling fan turned slowly above her, slicing the air into gentle pieces. Her phone rested on the nightstand. It stayed quiet. She didn't check for messages. She didn't brace for them either. She let the space exist as it was, unanswered, open. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't always arrive as a feeling towards someone else. Sometimes it arrived as restraint toward yourself, as the choice not to keep pouring bitterness into a small cup and calling it strength. She turned onto her side and listened to the soft mechanical rhythm of the fan. Her breath matched it without effort. The anger hadn't vanished, but it no longer dominated the room. It was just one element among many, like salt in the air near the ocean. Present, but not overwhelming. Tomorrow she might speak up, or she might set a boundary, or she might decide that some conversations didn't deserve the same energy anymore. All of those options were still available. Tonight she didn't need to solve it. She closed her eyes and let the quiet do its work. The water inside her felt clean again. He didn't think of the other person as an enemy. Not out loud anyway. He used softer words. Difficult, toxic, impossible. But in his body it felt the same, a tightness that showed up the second he saw their name. A heat that rose before he even chose it. That afternoon, he came home later than usual and didn't take his shoes off right away. He stood in the entryway with his keys still in his hand, staring at nothing. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that gives your mind room to start building a whole movie. He'd had a conversation earlier that didn't go well. It wasn't a screaming fight. It was worse in a way: controlled voices, polite language, and that cold, sharp feeling underneath. The kind of exchange where you walk away looking fine, but your chest stays tight for hours after. Now he sat in his living room with one lamp on and the rest of the lights off. The TV stayed dark. He didn't want noise. He didn't want distraction. He wanted something to make sense. On the coffee table was an empty chair across from him. Just a simple dining chair he'd pulled in earlier when he cleaned and never moved back. Nothing special about it. But tonight it stood out in the dim room like it had a purpose. He stared at it, and without meaning to, he started talking in his head. Not to the chair exactly. To the person he was angry with. He replayed the conversation. He corrected his own lines. He imagined better comebacks, stronger boundaries, cooler delivery. He imagined saying the one sentence that would finally make them understand. It never worked. The imaginary version of them never softened. They always had another excuse, another deflection, another way to make him feel like he was overreacting. Even in his own mind, he couldn't win. He stood up, walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it too fast. The cold hit his throat and didn't fix anything. He leaned on the counter, jaw tight, and felt the anger in his body looking for a place to land. It would have been so easy to call them, or text, or send some final clear message that said, "I'm done." That's what anger wants sometimes. A clean cut, a dramatic release. A door slammed so loudly the whole house knows it happened. But he didn't want drama. He wanted peace, and peace felt far away. He went back to the living room and sat down again facing the empty chair. He didn't know why he kept looking at it. Maybe because the chair was simple. It didn't argue. It didn't twist his words. It didn't demand anything. It just sat there quiet. And then he remembered something a therapist had once said years ago in a session he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes imagine the person you're furious with as a child. Not to excuse them, just to see them. At the time, he'd rolled his eyes. It had sounded like therapy speak, like a trick. But now, staring at the empty chair, he tried it anyway. Not with enthusiasm, not with hope. Just as an experiment he didn't have to believe in. He pictured the person sitting there, but not as they were now. He pictured them much younger, small, maybe 7 or 8, legs not reaching the floor, swinging slightly. A kid in a hoodie that was a little too big. The kind of kid who had learned early how to act tough so no one would see how scared they were. The image wasn't clear. He didn't know their childhood story. He wasn't inventing a whole biography. He just held the simplest version, a small person with pain they didn't know how to handle. And to his surprise, the anger in his chest didn't get bigger. It hesitated. Not because he suddenly felt warm toward them. He didn't. But something shifted in the story. The story moved from their evil to their hurt. And hurt people don't always act in ways that make sense. Hurt people often act in ways that spread hurt. That didn't make it okay. It just made it less personal. He felt a small release in his shoulders, like a knot loosening. It was subtle, but it was real. He breathed out and realized he'd been holding his breath. He stared at the chair again and let the image stay there, this smaller version, sitting silently, not defending, not attacking, just existing. He thought if that kid had been held better, would this adult still be like this? He didn't know. There was no answer. But the question itself softened something. He looked down at his hands. They were clenched without him noticing. He opened them slowly, fingers relaxing one by one, and rested them on his thighs. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about pretending they didn't cause harm. Maybe it was about refusing to keep carrying the harm in his own body hour after hour, day after day. The chair stayed empty, of course. The room stayed quiet. But inside him, something had stopped sprinting. He stayed seated longer than he meant to. The room didn't change, but his body did. The heat that had been pushing against his ribs softened into something duller, heavier. Not gone, just quieter. Like a sound fading into the background once you stop listening for it. The image of the child in the chair lingered. Not vividly, more like a presence. A small shape that didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't justify anything. Just sat there, legs dangling, waiting. He noticed how different his breath felt now. Still not calm exactly, but deeper, less sharp. His chest wasn't braced the way it had been earlier, like it was preparing for impact that never came. He thought about how much effort anger takes, how it asks you to stay alert, to remember details, to keep score, how it demands your attention again and again, long after the moment has passed. Carrying it had started to feel like a second job. He stood up and walked to the window, resting his hand against the glass. Outside, the street was quiet. A porch light glowed a few houses down. Somewhere a dog barked once and stopped. The world didn't seem to be holding its breath the way he had been. When he turned back to the chair, the image shifted slightly. The child wasn't looking at him anymore, just staring at the floor, shoulders slightly hunched, like someone used to being misunderstood or not seen at all. He felt a brief ache in his chest, not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. He knew that posture. He'd worn it himself once years ago in different rooms with different people. That realization didn't erase the harm that had been done. It didn't change the words that had been said or the way they had landed. But it did something quieter. It interrupted the story that said this pain needed to keep circulating forever. He realized then that he'd been confusing forgiveness with closeness, as if letting go meant reopening doors that had already proven unsafe, as if easing his grip meant inviting more damage. But forgiveness, at least the kind he could live with, didn't require any of that. It didn't ask him to call. It didn't ask him to explain. It didn't ask him to reconcile. It only asked him to stop letting this person live rent-free inside his body. He walked back to the couch and sat down again, this time not directly facing the chair, just beside it. The child image faded on its own like a daydream losing focus when you stop feeding it. What remained was a simple truth he hadn't allowed himself to feel before he was tired of being angry. Not because anger was wrong, but because it had stopped serving him. It had protected him once. It had signaled something important. But now, it was just repeating itself, asking for energy he didn't have. He placed his feet flat on the floor and let his hands rest open on his thighs. The room felt larger somehow. Or maybe he felt less crowded inside it. He thought about tomorrow, about what he might say or not say, about boundaries that didn't need speeches, about distance that didn't require hostility. Those options existed now calmly, without urgency. The empty chair stayed where it was just furniture again. Wood and fabric, no story attached. He stood, turned off the lamp, and let the room go dark. The anger hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like a storm he had to stand inside. It felt more like weather that had passed through and moved on. As he lay down, he noticed how his jaw finally unclenched on its own. His shoulders settled into the mattress. His breath found a rhythm that didn't need guidance. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't something he did for the person who hurt him. It was something he allowed himself so he didn't have to keep replaying the same moment every night. He didn't need to rewrite the past. He didn't need to understand them better. He didn't need an apology to rest. He just needed to stop sitting across from an empty chair arguing with someone who wasn't there. The house stayed quiet. The night held its shape. And for the first time in a while, he let himself be held by it too. The path around the pond is quiet at night. Not silent, just calm in a way that doesn't ask to be noticed. Crickets fill the air with a steady rhythm. Somewhere nearby, water moves gently against the edge, a soft sound that blends into everything else. The pond itself is still. Moonlight stretches across the surface, pale and clear. The reflection is sharp tonight, almost solid. It looks close enough to touch, close enough to reach for. There's a pause at the edge of the water. The moon seems to float right there, resting on the surface, as if it belongs to the pond. It's easy to forget where it really is. Easy to believe that if you reached out carefully, slowly enough, you could hold it. That's how worry works. It presents itself as something real, something tangible, something you can grasp if you just try hard enough, if you think about it long enough, if you reach a little further. A hand moves forward, hovering above the water. The reflection stays perfectly still, undisturbed. Convincing. The thought arrives quietly. What if this never works out? It feels solid, grounded, logical, like the moon in the water right there demanding attention. The hand lowers slightly. The water breaks. Ripples spread outward fast and uneven. The reflection shatters instantly, breaking into fragments that move away from each other, disappearing into motion. The moon is suddenly nowhere to be found. The hand pulls back. The pond doesn't look empty now. It looks restless, disturbed. What was clear moments ago is now confused, scattered, unreadable. That familiar tightening appears in the chest. This happens so easily. One anxious thought appears. It feels real, close, manageable. So the mind reaches for it, engages with it, tries to understand it, control it, fix it. And the moment it's touched, everything stirs. The worry multiplies, splits, sends ripples through other thoughts. Memories get pulled in, futures are imagined. The original concern becomes harder to see, not clearer. The moon was never in the water, but the mind forgets that. The surface of the pond slowly begins to calm again. Ripples widen, soften, then fade. The reflection returns piece by piece until the moon appears whole once more. Nothing was broken. Nothing was lost. Only the surface was disturbed. The same is true inside. When anxiety shows up, it often looks like truth, like reality, like something you must respond to. But many worries are reflections, not facts. Images shaped by light and movement, not by substance. The trouble starts when the mind tries to grab them. Another thought drifts through, I should think this through more. It sounds responsible, almost caring. But the memory of the water lingers. Reaching doesn't bring clarity. It brings ripples. The path curves slightly around the pond. Walking resumes slow and unhurried. The moon's reflection follows, staying just out of reach, unchanged by movement along the shore. The moon itself, high above, remains untouched by everything happening below. It hasn't moved. It hasn't reacted. It hasn't been affected. There's a subtle comfort in that. The worries that appeared earlier don't feel gone. They're still present somewhere, like the reflection still resting on the surface. But they no longer feel solid. They no longer feel like something that must be handled right now. They feel like what they are: images. Anxiety doesn't always lie, but it often exaggerates. It takes something distant and makes it feel close. Takes something imagined and makes it feel urgent. Like mistaking a reflection for the thing itself, the pond grows quieter again. The moon settles back into its place on the water, bright and unreachable. The path continues forward, lit just enough to see where the next step goes. No reaching, just walking, just letting the surface be. The water settles more quickly this time. Ripples stretch outward, then thin, then disappear into the dark. The surface becomes smooth again, like nothing ever touched it. The moon's reflection returns without effort, clear and whole, exactly where it was before. It didn't need to be fixed. It didn't need to be guided back. It simply appeared when the surface stopped moving. That detail lingers. The mind often assumes clarity comes from effort, from reaching, analyzing, rehearsing, from keeping a thought close until it finally gives up its meaning. But standing by the pond, watching the reflection return on its own, it's hard to ignore the opposite truth. Some things become clear only when they're left alone. Another worry shows up quieter than before. It doesn't announce itself. It just slips in, familiar and subtle. The kind that usually grows if given even a little attention. It's noticed immediately, not judged, not pushed away, just seen, like noticing a cloud pass across the moon. There's no reaching this time. No attempt to grab the thought, shape it, or pull answers from it. It's allowed to hover the way the reflection hovers on the water, present but untouchable. Without interference, it doesn't intensify. It doesn't branch out. It doesn't send ripples through everything else. It stays thin. The path curves again, moving farther from the pond. Trees line the edge now, their silhouettes dark against the night sky. The moon is partially hidden behind branches, visible in pieces. And yet it's still there, even when it can't be fully seen. The same is true for peace. It doesn't disappear just because it's obscured. It doesn't leave just because worry passes in front of it. It remains steady and unchanged, even when the surface looks busy. Anxiety feels convincing because it borrows light from something real. It reflects fear, memory, imagination, and turns them into images that look solid. But when examined closely, when touched, it falls apart into movement. This isn't something that needs to be remembered as a lesson. It's something that can be felt. The difference between reaching and not reaching, between stirring the surface and letting it rest, between mistaking the reflection for the moon. The night air feels cooler now. The sounds around the pond soften. Crickets quiet down. Water laps gently against the shore, no longer disturbed. There's a growing ease in not needing to do anything about what appears. Thoughts still rise. They always will. Reflections will continue to show up on the surface of the mind. But they don't all need to be engaged. They don't all need to be touched. Some can be seen and left exactly where they are. The moon hasn't followed the movement along the path. It hasn't tried to keep up. It doesn't care where attention goes. It simply stays where it is. That's the quiet reassurance in this moment. You don't have to chase clarity. You don't have to capture peace. You don't have to reach for what's already present. The path eventually turns away from the pond entirely. The reflection disappears from view not because it's gone, but because the angle has changed. The moon remains above, unseen but steady, and the mind, having stopped reaching, feels lighter, less busy, less pulled in different directions, not empty, just untroubled. The water behind returns to complete stillness. The reflection holds undisturbed by footsteps now far away. Nothing needed to be taken. Nothing needed to be held. The moment passed, and everything remained exactly where it belonged. The moon in the sky, the reflection on the water, and the mind no longer trying to grasp what was never meant to be touched. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe, so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go, drift, and let these truths become your own. My thoughts are settling like sediment in a glass of still water. Go of all ripples. The surface of my mind is becoming glass. Like a river flows to the ocean, my worries flow away from me. Obstacles without resistance. The waters of sleep are washing over my tired eyes. Floating in a sea of tranquility, weightless and free. Breath is like the tide, flowing in and flowing out. Deep below the surface waves, my inner ocean is silent. I release the day just as a leaf drifts down a stream. Cool, healing water soothes my nervous system. Merging into the velvet depths of rest. There is no need to swim. I simply float. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. Clear, transparent, and still. I am clear, transparent, and still. Transparent and still. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Water fills a cup. Water fills a cup. Fills me like water fills a cup.